Reverse as well. Pretty much, the looper alone, I mean, the potential is endless if you can get creative with it. Play percussion on your guitar, you know, whatever. But if you screw up, it'll repeat over and over. But the good thing is if you screw up and you catch it right away, you can just hit undo, and it'll just get rid of the last thing you did. Well, in the world of delay or echo and whatnot, in the old days, the way they would do it is they would actually rig a device. I think Les Paul might have created it, but I'm not too sure. I know he created multi-track recording, but to create an echo in the studio, in the old days, they'd have to like basically go into an area that physically had an echo, you know, like an open chamber or stairwell and whatnot, mic that environment, and they'd get their little slapback. To create an echo, the guy had this idea to rig this tape machine that had multiple heads, and as the tape came around, it would record on the first head, play back on the second head, and gradually erase on the third one. So when it came back around, what you were actually hearing was yourself being recorded, played back, and gradually erased as it came looping around. Now what that did, I mean, that's how they had to do it at the time, because that's the only technology that was available to them. As it went on later, you know, the digital delay and whatnot. Digital delay is essentially a sampler. Analog delay, all it's doing is running your signal through a bunch of chips that slows it down from actually coming out of the output into your amp. So a lot of people, technology-wise, when the delay was out, it was the coolest thing, and then it came about longer delays. People wanted longer delays, so they came out with digital delay. So in terms of function, that seemed right, but as time went on, they realized that the old analog stuff actually sounded better, mainly because the limitations of that technology kind of warmed the sound up a little bit by removing, you know, some of the highs and whatnot. I know it might sound boring, but it's kind of interesting, you know. With digital delay, basically, it kind of sounds not cold and sterile, but I mean, essentially what it's doing is playing it back exactly what it hears. So there's no enhancement going on. Now, there's a place in the effects market for that. You know, you listen to U2, 90% of their stuff is running through analog and digital delays. You can still get creative with it. Effects pedals break down in a couple categories. You have front-end effects, which would be considered your compressors, distortions, wah pedals, sometimes EQ, but they can go in the loop as well, boost pedals. A lot of that stuff goes into the front end of the amp. Then you have the modulation effects, which would be your phasers, flangers, coarse, and tremolo and vibrato. Generally, those go in the loop of the amp. Does anyone know what an effects loop is? Nobody? Okay. There's two stages to most amplifiers nowadays. Some of the more expensive amps will have an effects loop, and what that does, I don't know if you've ever hooked up, say, maybe you bought a reverb pedal. You thought, yeah, this is the coolest thing, right? Plug into it, plug into your little practice amp, you turn the distortion on, you play it, and then you get this really bad decay sound. I can mimic that right here, actually. The reverb by itself. Put a distortion on in front of it, as if I got that reverb pedal and just plug it straight into that. That pedal sucks, right? But actually, what you want to do is you want to run the amp signal through that pedal. Remember when I first bought like a reverb pedal, I literally like threw it in the closet. I'm like, man, I got gypped. I went to the guy's like, dude, that sounds nothing like when you showed me at the store, and I was just a little kid, right? And of course, he's like, no, you knucklehead, you got to put in the effects loop. And I'm like, what's an effects loop? And of course, my amp didn't have it, because they had a little 10-watt Marshall amp. But some of the higher end amps, well, in the realm of pedals, distortion would go before that. So usually wahs first, then maybe, well, you go compressor, wah, distortion, then all your modulation stuff. Now some of it's not to say that you can't put some of those loop effects into the front end of your amp, because some of the classic sounds came from doing that, because in the 60s, early 70s, a lot of the amps didn't have effects loops. So some of those sounds actually do sound good going into the front end. Like Van Halen, for instance, he always had a phase 90 going into the front end of his amp, pretty much on all the time. And when it's just processing your guitar signal before the distortion, it's a little more subtle and not quite as obvious. Let me show you. Phaser. So going into the front end of a distortion. Like a lush, swooshing sound, which is reminiscent of like old Hendrix songs. Robin Trower, he was a big user of that effect. Actually, it was the Univibe that he used, going straight in. And with the Univibe, and essentially the phasers were originally supposed to do is mimic what a Leslie did. A lot of guitar players would see all these Hammond organ players, and you have this Leslie, this giant speaker cabinet with a spinning speaker, and it created this huge, like, chorusing, just a really huge chorus sound. Aside from bringing a giant speaker cabinet and hooking it up to your amp, it was so unpractical, so all these guys were trying to find ways to cram that sound into a box or something you could bring to your gig without breaking your back, obviously. And plus, those old Leslies, I mean, you can't beat the sound, but they're hard to maintain, they're expensive, they always break, and really, who wants to set one up, you know? So essentially the first Univibe kind of mimicked that. And Hendrix used it a lot. Let me show you. That's fuzz before Univibe. Let me flip it like that. That's what's great about this. If you put a pedal in a certain order, you don't have to yank the cables out and flip-flop them if it sounds wrong. You can just do it right there. Like you're at Woodstock, huh? But that's basically Univibe going straight into a facial fuzz, which is kind of like how Jimmy did it. He used the fuzz going into the amp to kind of kick it in an overdrive. I'll get more into that later. But part of the appeal of that sound was a sheer accident. It was just basically just limits of technology. You know, you had to plug it into the front end of the amp. There's no other way for it to go in. Now you can put it post and there's more signal to process, but it doesn't quite sound the same. It's kind of a classic sound, you know. And there's really no rules with these effects. I mean, however you want to use them to get your vision across, it's what they're for, you know. It's more of a tool. I wouldn't rely on them entirely for your sound. I'd say the foundation, it has to start with the guitar and the amp, and being able to play, obviously, but guitar and the amp is the most important thing. Those should sound pretty good, at least. And then pedals just kind of enhance that.